Hello everyone. This is going to be the first video in our lecture series on nutrition and metabolism. This is a logical follow-up to our last chapter, which was the digestive system, because after we bring in the food, digest, and absorb it, what are we going to do next with much of those nutrients? You guessed it, we're going to metabolize them for energy. I want to say that again because I want to bridge the gap between the digestive system and the metabolism chapter. It goes in order. So in the digestive system, we talked about how we bring in food, we digest it, break it down, and we absorb it. And we absorb those nutrients into the blood. And then what's going to happen next with many of those nutrients, carbs and fat specifically, we're going to metabolize them for energy. So that's going to be one of the focuses of this chapter. Little cartoon for you as I'm talking. Many people get intimidated by this chapter, metabolism, and probably for good reason, because it can be quite tricky. To be honest with you, it's not my favorite chapter either. But if we can pick apart some of the important pieces here and there to really get the important messages through, that's all we got to do. So my goal with this is not to weigh you down with all the minutia of all the chemical reactions, all the enzymes, all that. That's not the goal. Instead, we want to take a broad view of the series of chemical reactions that happen, give you some details to fill in some pieces, but we're going to stay pretty overall in our view. Okay, so we're going to talk about some definitions, what metabolism is, and then we're going to spend most of this time talking about cellular respiration, everyone's favorite topic. Not. We'll end by talking about metabolic states and rates. And then at the very end, we go through carbs, fat, and protein and some specific things with them. Okay, bear with me. You can do it. And look, to help you out, I've even put the most important things in green. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. So, start with some basic definitions. You can do this. What is a basic definition of metabolism? We've all heard the word. Let's get more detailed. Guess what? Metabolism. It's the sum of all the chemical reactions in the body. That's it. Metabolism, the sum of all the chemical reactions in the body. We tend to think about metabolism in terms of the chemical reactions involved with breaking down food for energy. This is kind of long-winded, but that's okay. Might as well get my money's worth out of this fancy pen, huh? So we tend to think about metabolism as breaking down nutrients for energy. And guess what? Breaking down nutrients for energy, that involves chemical reactions. But metabolism doesn't just refer to this. It refers to all of the chemical reactions. So when we talk about metabolism, not only are we talking about the chemical reactions needed to break down food for energy, we're also talking about all the other chemical reactions that are happening. The chemical reactions happening with muscles in order to contract. The chemical reactions happening in order for glands to produce and release hormones. The chemical reactions happening for everything. So metabolism is more than just the chemical reactions needed to break down food for energy. Metabolism is the sum of all the chemical reactions. If we were to break down all the chemical reactions, there's really only two types of chemical reactions. Those chemical reactions that are catabolic and those chemical reactions that are anabolic. Keep it simple. A catabolic reaction is when we're breaking down. We start with something big, and through a chemical reaction, we break it down into something smaller. What is an example of catabolism? Breaking down a complex carb into a simple sugar. It's catabolic, starting with something big and breaking it down into smaller. On the other hand, any chemical reaction that is deemed anabolic is when you're synthesizing or building. So in an anabolic reaction, it would look something like this. We would take A plus B, and that would yield AB. This could be the formation of ATP because we take ADP and we add that third phosphate to make it ATP. But the idea is it's building, it's anabolic. So make sure you review these definitions. Why do we care so much about this? Well, even though metabolism refers to all the chemical reactions, we're going to be focusing most on, you guessed it, cellular respiration. So even though metabolism refers to all the chemical reactions, we're going to be focusing on the process whereby cells convert glucose into ATP. The process where cells convert glucose into ATP is called cellular respiration. We may remember, glucose itself, even though it's an energy source, glucose itself is not in a usable form. So in order for our cells to be able to use glucose, we must break it down into ATP, because ATP is our cell's usable energy source. The process where we do this, convert glucose into ATP, is called cellular respiration. Now, what we're going to find out is that we can convert fat eventually into ATP, and in rarer instances, we can also take protein and convert it into ATP. But the basis of our conversation starts with glucose, because the steps that we take to convert glucose into ATP are the same steps that fat and protein are going to jump in on. You see I have the tombstone here. It's a little bit morbid, but the idea is if our cells are not able to produce ATP and our cells don't have energy, what's going to happen to them? They're going to die. So this is a really important process. I just said this, so just putting on a slide to make sure everybody's clear. We know glucose can be used for energy, but glucose itself is not in a usable form. We have to convert glucose into ATP, adenosine triphosphate, because that is what's usable by the cells. Here's a definition again: cellular respiration, the process where we convert glucose, as I said, or fat or protein, into ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. You don't need to know that, but I think it's important that you've heard the term so you can pick it up if you had to. ATP is the fuel for everything. I've given you some examples, but really, ATP is the fuel for everything, and that's why it's so exciting. Again, making my point in green, ATP is the usable energy source. Boom. A couple things to point out. ATP is not able to be stored. And this is different than glucose. We know we can store glucose. Everybody remembers, I hope, the storage form of glucose is glycogen. So this is really beneficial. If we have a bunch of glucose in the blood and we don't need all that glucose in the blood at one time, we can store some glucose as glycogen. Store a glycogen in the liver, store a glycogen in the skeletal muscles. And then when needed, we can break break glycogen back down to glucose. But this is not the case for ATP. ATP cannot be stored, so it is produced on an as-needed basis. All right, good stuff. Oh, you know that I couldn't have a lecture, whether it's on campus or whether it's virtual. I couldn't have a lecture with introducing a little something, something. So just to keep things interesting, you can see here, as you know, I'm from Maryland, and these are my peeps. I'm a big baseball fan. So in talking about the players involved in metabolism, I've taken this probably too far, and I have some players here. But this is the last time the Orioles won the World Series, 1983. I was 4 years old, so I don't remember it. Damn it. Okay, enough about that. Let's talk about some of the players. So we're about to go through the specific steps of cellular respiration. We're going to go through the specific chemical steps of how we convert glucose into ATP. There are some things involved, and we might have to discuss them first. So we talk about enzymes. We know that for pretty much any chemical reaction, we're going to have enzymes. And we're also going to have something called coenzymes, and they're going to be really important. Lastly, we'll introduce some of the types of chemical reactions. So these players, when they get together, there's different ways that they play the game of metabolism. Let's give a little intro. Make sure you review enzymes. I think we've come at this a couple of times in A&P 1 and maybe A&P 2, but just make sure you spend as much time as you need to get these basics. What are enzymes? Well, enzymes are tiny proteins that catalyze or speed up chemical reactions. Catalyze is just a fancy word for speeds up. So enzymes catalyze or speed up chemical reactions. Would chemical reactions still occur without enzymes? The answer is yes, but they would occur so slowly that our body wouldn't be able to keep up with producing enough energy for the demands. So even though chemical reactions would still theoretically work without enzymes, they would happen so slowly that our body would not be able to keep up what it needs to be doing. How do enzymes speed up chemical reactions? Enzymes speed up chemical reactions by lowering the activation energy that's needed. And this is a pretty simple graph that illustrates this point. If for a usual chemical reaction, because many chemical reactions require energy, we're doing some kind of chemical work. So if for a given chemical reaction, we need this much energy. How about we change colors? Let's see if I can figure this out. What do y'all think about red? Let's try it. Usually, if these are units of energy, usually for a chemical reaction, it requires this much energy. That's a lot. When I have an enzyme present, it only means that this much energy is needed. So how is it that enzymes speed up chemical reactions? They lower the amount of energy needed to complete that chemical reaction. Without the enzyme, you need a lot of energy. I'm all the way up here. We can apply fake units. Let's say 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. So let's say that without the enzyme, I need 60 units of energy. But with the enzyme, 10, 20, I only need 25 units. So if it takes less energy to get that chemical reaction done, then the chemical reaction can happen faster. Excellent. Some other things that you should be reviewing about enzymes. Let's go back to black, as Amy Winehouse once said. Enzymes are specific, or they demonstrate specificity. So each enzyme can only work on a specific substrate. You know this. Didn't we talk about amylase? We talked about amylase in the digestive system. Amylase is an enzyme that can only work on starch. This is an example of specificity. So each enzyme, the big purple blob is an enzyme, each enzyme can only fit into a certain substrate, like a lock and a key or a puzzle piece. Specificity. The other thing I want to say about this is that the enzymes leave the chemical reactions unchanged. So if you notice, if this series of pictures demonstrates how an enzyme starts, binds to a substrate, speeds up chemical reaction, and then chemical reaction is done. The enzyme is the same structure as it was at the beginning. It leaves the chemical reaction unchanged. So what that means is enzymes can be reused. And of course, our body likes anything that is efficient. Excellent. So you're going to be reviewing what we're focusing on, specifically what's in green. Okay. In addition to enzymes, often we're going to need some other players, some other things in order to complete chemical reactions. There may be a cofactor, an apoenzyme. I'm giving one example of another thing we might need, and that's a coenzyme. So we talk about the enzymes. Well, sometimes we also need these coenzymes. Here's a lovely picture. Here we can see our big purple blob enzyme. So if this whole thing is an enzyme, guess what? Sometimes we have a little added buddy called a coenzyme. So sometimes we have a little added buddy called a coenzyme. In the process of cellular respiration, we're going to be talking about some specific coenzymes. Maybe you've seen these before and you wanted to vomit, NAD plus and FAD plus, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, flavin adenine dinucleotide. I know, it makes me nauseous too. But I just want to point out that you don't really have to know the big fancy name of the chemicals. But all I'm pointing out is these, NAD and FAD, they are coenzymes. And we've already established that coenzymes are little buddies on the enzyme. And what they do is they're helpers. They assist enzymes. Most specifically, in the case of cellular respiration, NAD and FAD, they assist by carrying electrons. We're going to talk later about the electron transport chain as one series of chemical reactions. Well, guess what? In the electron transport chain, we're going to need some coenzymes to carry and transport the electrons. Hence the picture of the cute little dog. If the dog was the enzyme, then the little backpack would be the coenzyme. And inside the backpack would be electrons. Look at that. We're going to make it as simple as we can. NAD and FAD are simply coenzymes. They're helpers. They're attached to the enzyme, and they simply carry electrons. Okay, the last thing to talk about before we get into the specifics of cellular respiration are types of chemical reactions. Here's a listing of some of the most commonly used types of chemical reactions: oxidation, reduction, substrate level phosphorylation, and oxidative phosphorylation. For our purposes, here we go. Oxidation is any chemical reaction where oxygen is gained. I think we can understand by the word, if something oxidizes, I don't know, the O reminds me of oxygen. If fruit oxidizes, it turns color because it's exposed to oxygen, or metal can rust because it's exposed to oxygen. So oxidation, oxygen is gained. By process of elimination, in reduction, oxygen is lost. But we're really going to focus more, well, let me rephrase that. We're going to focus also on hydrogen. And hydrogen is the opposite. If in oxidation, oxygen is gained, then hydrogen is lost. If in reduction, oxygen is lost, then hydrogen is gained. Little tricky, I know. How to remember. And if I go back here, we can also talk about these reactions in terms of electrons. So sometimes oxidation and reduction reactions, they'll talk about them in terms of what's happening with the hydrogen, or what's happening with the oxygen, or what's happening with the electrons. And these chemists wonder why we sometimes get nauseous with all this chemistry. Not everybody, just some people. So what's a way to remember oxidation and reduction? Maybe you've heard of this before from your microbiology teacher. It's actually quite a good way to remember it. Oil rig. Oxidation is loss. Reduction is gain. And we're talking about loss of electrons or hydrogen. And this is where we're talking about. So, O, oxidation, I is L, loss of hydrogen. Oxygen is loss of hydrogen, reduction is gain of hydrogen. So think about this in terms of hydrogen. Oxygen is loss of hydrogen, reduction is gain. Okay, we're going to break down substrate level phosphorylation into a pretty simplistic definition. Hope it's okay with you. I can't see you, so I don't know if you're actually raising your hand to protest that you want to learn more about substrate level phosphorylation, but I'm guessing that you're okay with simplifying it. We're going to focus on one aspect of substrate level phosphorylation. And when we say phosphorylation, we are transferring a phosphate. You can imagine on our next lecture exam on Blackboard having to match or pick from a multiple choice what is the definition of phosphorylation. For our purposes, we're talking about phosphorylation being the transfer of phosphate. Typically, the phosphate is being transferred from adenosine diphosphate from something else. But let's keep it simple. Transfer of phosphate. And in doing so, by transferring, we're adding, really, because we're transferring to something. Oxidative phosphorylation, this is going to be the final step of cellular respiration. But you know what? It's pretty complicated. So for our purposes right now, you don't have to worry about it. Again, I can't see you out there, but I'm guessing there's no hands going up in protest. So don't worry about that for now. Okay, so we're about to talk about the specific steps of cellular respiration, which is going to be glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. Oh my God, I bet you can't wait. But I do want to do one quick review before we start talking about those specific chemical steps. When we talk about cells, let me go back for a second. When we talk about cells, cells need a lot of things. If we imagine a cell as a little factory, here's my cell, here's my nucleus, here's my endoplasmic reticulum, all that good stuff. Cells, if they're like a working factory, they need a lot of things. So what are some of the things that cells need in order to be able to carry out their duties? Well, most of the time they need oxygen. So we need to have oxygen going in, and we also need to be getting rid of CO2. And we talked about that in the respiratory system. So think back to this semester. One of the things that every working cell needs is oxygen, and we need to get rid of CO2. Something else that cells need in order to do their thing are nutrients. So not only do we need to supply them with gases, we also have to supply them with nutrients, like glucose. Here's my little hexagon glucose. So we need to bring in glucose. And with all these supplies, what is the cell going to be able to do? So once we give the working factory of the cell all the supplies that it needs, oxygen, nutrients, what is it able to do? It's able to produce ATP. Because that's why we need all these supplies. Why do we need oxygen into the cell? Because we want to be able to rely on oxidative means to produce ATP, because they're much more efficient. Why do cells need glucose? Because glucose is going to be able to help the cells produce ATP. So I'm just trying to bring everything together so we can see a common thread through all of our chapters that we're talking about. So when we talk about how the cells produce ATP, if I can take this analogy even further, how are the cells going to produce ATP? And they produce ATP through a series of chemical reactions. And there's different types of chemical reactions that produce energy for different purposes and that give energy for different lengths of time. By the way, this all here is extra. I'm just trying to bring it together. I'm not going to ask you an essay question on how the respiratory and the digestive and I'm not going to ask you that. But here's what I want to talk about. This I very well could ask you. Okay, so when we talk about what are the energy systems? What are the series of chemical reactions that cells use to create energy? And I know sometimes this can be a little confusing, so it might be beneficial for you to separate it in your brain. Because later in this chapter, we're going to be talking about cellular respiration, how the cells produce ATP. And that's going to most of the time stay the same. There's the same steps to produce ATP. But sometimes we have to make slight changes in how we use that ATP. It's a little more complicated than that, but my advice is just separate it. So you're going to memorize what I'm talking about on this slide, keep that in one part of your brain, and then later you're going to be memorizing some of the specific parts of cellular respiration. Let's just go through this in order, and I think it'll help to make it clearer. So we have different energy systems to cells, and that's going to be the key phrase. So if you see this on an exam question, you want to index in your brain to these three energy systems. If, for example, and we'll use muscle cells because it's an easy example. If a muscle cell needs quick energy, you're about to do a vertical jump. How long does that take? 2 or 3 seconds. Fine. If a cell needs quick energy, the first energy system our cells utilize is called the phosphagen, or you may hear it called the phosphocreatine system. So if our cells need quick energy, this is what they're going to go to first. A series of chemical reactions. These chemical reactions are anaerobic. They do not require oxygen. And as a result of these chemical reactions, we will produce energy for about 10 seconds. Think about these in order. When our cells need energy right away, the first means of energy system they're going to use is called the phosphagen system. It is anaerobic, and it can produce energy for about 10 seconds. But what if we need a cell to be able to have energy that's lasting longer than 10 seconds? What if I'm doing some kind of exercise that takes a minute? I'm doing a sprint that's a minute long. Well, my cells are first going to get energy from the phosphagen system for the first 10 seconds. But as I continue to exercise, my muscles are going to have to begin to use a second energy system. So after getting energy for the first 10 seconds through the phosphagen system, the next 60 or 90 seconds, I use a process called anaerobic glycolysis. It's also anaerobic. You can read about how, but that's not going to be on the test. I'd like you just to be able to know what is the order of energy systems that our cells go to. I'd like you to know whether they're aerobic or anaerobic. And I'd like you to know how long they produce energy for. But if I'm exercising, and let's say the exercise is 10 minutes. Well, if it's 10 minutes long, the first 10 seconds, I got energy from here. The next minute to minute and a half, I got energy from here. The third energy system that our cells will use is the aerobic metabolism. And this tells us, aerobic, that it is aerobic. So it means that we need oxygen for this. And this should make sense. If I need quick energy, I'm not going to have time to increase respiratory rate, to bring in oxygen all the way through the airways, to exchange it with the lungs and the blood, transport that oxygenated blood out to the tissues, do a second transport between the blood and the tissues. That takes time. So we have to have a way to get quick energy without oxygen. But after about a minute, minute and a half, 2 minutes, then we've given enough time for respiratory rate to increase where I can bring in more oxygen and we can start to produce energy aerobically, which we like to do because aerobic metabolism gives us the most energy output. Last point I want to make is that these energy systems occur along a spectrum. So during an exercise session, we can move between these. Let's say I'm doing a sprint for a minute. I'm going to start here, produce energy that way, and then produce energy this way. But it's not impossible that after that sprint, I rest for 10 seconds, and then I start to do another sprint. And maybe I have to go back to this way to produce energy. So we're able to move between these energy systems in an ongoing continuum. Okay. Carbohydrates we can utilize during the second and third energy systems. Fats and protein can only be utilized for the third. So if I go back to this, let's change color here. What do you think about, I wish I could put green on here. I guess we'll use blue. Okay. For this energy system, the first one, we're actually using something called creatine phosphate. For energy system number 2, I can only use carbs because carbs give us quick energy. For energy system 3, I can use carbs, but I can also use fat, and I can also use protein. This shouldn't be that alarming to you because we know that carbs are a quick energy source. So if I need quick energy, the only nutrient I'm going to be able to utilize is carbs. And as we get into that longer lasting energy, I'm going to be able to do fat or protein in addition. So that's what this next slide is saying. Okay. We can skip that. Okay. Now, I'm getting a little excited. Even though this is not my favorite topic, anytime I get the joy of passing along some information to you and hopefully passing it along in a way that you can actually make some sense of it, boy, that gets me excited. Even here in my home office, gets me really excited. So we're about to talk about the 3 steps of cellular respiration. And those 3 steps of cellular respiration are glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. I'm going to be coming back to this diagram. This summarizes the energy production of each phase. What I want to point out here, if we enter 1 glucose molecule into cellular respiration, how many ATP can we yield using aerobic? Because remember, we can only, quick energy is only going to give us a couple ATP, and this will become clearer later. But if we're doing aerobic respiration, because we're going to find out that cellular respiration requires oxygen, at least the last 2 phases, for 1 glucose, I can produce a yield a net yield of 36 ATP. That is phenomenal. This is why it's so important to get oxygen down to the tissues. Because once we have oxygen and we can do energy production aerobically, we can produce so much more ATP. If I go back and we see these first two that are anaerobic, for example, during anaerobic glycolysis, for every 1 glucose, I can only produce a yield of 2 ATP. That's not great. I mean, it does its job because it's quick, but we want to get to the oxygen, because once that oxygen comes in, now for that 1 glucose, I can yield 36 ATP. More bang for our buck. Very efficient. You do not have to know all these numbers. You should know the circled number, though, that for 1 glucose, we have a net yield of 36 ATP. I'm so excited I had to get a drink of water. Little cartoon for you about the mitochondria. You know, now that we're in this situation and you're doing it from home, don't think you can be all lazy. I know you've got mitochondria in there. Plenty of energy. You may remember that's the organelle that produces energy. Meaning, many of these steps of cellular respiration are going to happen in the mitochondria. Okay, let's start talking about cellular respiration. Okay, some basics. Let me go back to the black. Okay, we've already talked about the process of cellular respiration is where we convert glucose. And by the way, this is a chemical formula for glucose. You don't have to know it. We can convert glucose into ATP. By the way, what do we notice on the front here? We have glucose plus oxygen. So for our cellular respiration, 1 glucose molecule, under the right conditions where I have oxygen, can produce a net of 36 ATP. Some other things to point out. The processes, the chemical reactions of cellular respiration are carried out in small steps. And at first, it makes you want to pull your hair out because all these small steps are so in-depth and detailed. But the idea is that it means that energy can be released as needed. And that's important because, you may recall, ATP cannot be stored. So if we were to do energy production in big whopping chunks, let's say we produce 20 ATP all at once, and then the next step we get to 36. We're likely to produce more than we can use, and then we've wasted energy using ATP that cannot be stored. So because we can't store ATP, we have to produce it in small steps so we can produce exactly what we need as not to waste. Last thing to point out here is that even though we're going to be focusing on glucose to start, we can bring fat and protein into this equation. And we can eventually convert fat and protein into ATP. So these same steps that we talk about for carbohydrates are going to have entry points that carbs and protein can pretty easily enter. All right, let's get into it. Are you ready for the best ever explanation? Here we go. Okay, 3 steps of cellular respiration, the process of converting glucose into ATP. We have glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. These happen in order. So we have glycolysis always has to happen first, which leads us into the Krebs cycle that happens next, which can only lead us into the electron transport chain, which happens last. This picture demonstrates some other things that are important. The first step, glycolysis, happens in the cytosol of the cell. In other words, out here in the fluid matrix of the cell. Whereas the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain happen inside the mitochondria. But of course, we're going to cover that, so don't you worry. Okay, in an effort to try and break these very complex chemical reactions down into more understandable pieces, for each phase, you will see the same layout, and I've put in green what I'd like you to know. So our first phase is glycolysis. It's happening first. Where is it happening? In the cytosol of the cell. We're not yet in the mitochondria. All the chemical reactions for glycolysis are anaerobic. They do not require oxygen. The overall goal of glycolysis, we have all these chemical reactions. What is the overall goal? The overall goal is really quite simple. We want to convert glucose into something called pyruvic acid. And that's the whole point of this first step. Convert glucose into pyruvic acid. Here it's called pyruvate. That's fine. Type of chemical reactions, we're going to be involving a lot of phosphorylation, which means to transfer and add a phosphate. And in addition to having an end product of pyruvic acid, we also have a net gain of 2 ATP. So maybe if I was studying for this myself and I wanted to just first memorize the most important parts, I might say, okay, glucose happens first. I might memorize that glycolysis happens first. I might memorize that glycolysis happens in the cytosol, and it does not require oxygen. I might memorize that the types of chemical reactions involved are phosphorylation. And I may remember that I'm starting with glucose, and I'm ending these chemical reactions with 2 pyruvic acids and 2 ATP. Boom. If you memorize those things, you will be able to answer any question I can ask you about glycolysis. Series of chemical reactions that happen first, occurs in the cytosol, does not require oxygen, involves phosphorylation chemical reactions, and what's really happening, we're converting glucose into, per 1 glucose, we form 2 pyruvic acid molecules, and we get 2 ATP. That's it. Now, if you wanted to get more specific, oh boy, could we. So if you were ever interested, or maybe you're taking micro or will take micro, and you have to know the specific things, I'm sharing with you what I learned when I was a student. I had a hard time with the textbooks because for me, I'm visual and I needed to see it all at once. So I'm sharing with you the first half of glycolysis and the second half of glycolysis. Yes, there was a point in time, a summer and a half ago, where I had all this memorized. Yikes. But this just gives you an understanding about how complicated this really is. We're using a bunch of enzymes. The enzymes are in green brackets. You can see the energy required and released are circled in blue. On the left, I go through each step individually. If we wanted to really get into it, what did we start with? We started with glucose. At the end of the day, what are we going to convert glucose into? Pyruvate or pyruvic acid. And per 1 glucose, we get 2 pyruvic acids. So this is just showing us in more specific steps with the enzymes in green and the substrates in red and the steps on the left. Oof, crazy. All right, what are some key points for glycolysis? Some of the steps are reversible, not all. Glycogen can enter it. So in addition to glucose coming in, we can also break down glycogen into glucose and then enter that. And I think it's important to point out a couple key enzymes. So you can see what I have here in green. One key enzyme that I'd like you to know is pyruvate kinase. Okay, pyruvate kinase. You can see I have it circled here. I just like you to be able to match up that it is pyruvate kinase that is one of the key enzymes in this series of chemical reactions. If I go back to what I have in red here, and I want to write down what to memorize as most important. We talked about glycolysis being the series of chemical reactions that happens first. We talked about glycolysis as occurring in the cytosol, not requiring oxygen, involving chemical reactions such as phosphorylation, that the overall goal of glycolysis is to convert glucose into 2 pyruvic acids and 2 ATPs. The only other thing I would add is one important enzyme called pyruvate kinase. Just be able to match this up, that this is an enzyme that's helpful in glycolysis. And if you think about it, it shouldn't be that much of a stretch, because what are we forming in glycolysis? We're forming pyruvate. So if you can remember that we're forming pyruvic acid, it should match that one of the enzymes is pyruvate kinase. It has the word pyruvate in it. And of course, we remember that enzymes tend to add in the suffix ase. All right. Let's talk about the Krebs cycle. Before we do that, there's an important thing that happens after glycolysis. So after glycolysis, we have pyruvic acid, right? So after glycolysis, we are left with pyruvic acid or pyruvate. What we're going to find is the next step of the cellular respiration is the Krebs cycle. And what do we notice about the Krebs cycle? It is aerobic. So in order for us to move from glycolysis into the Krebs cycle, we have to have oxygen. Now I go back. So we end glycolysis and we have pyruvate. If oxygen is present, then we are golden. If we have oxygen, then we are ready to go from glycolysis into the Krebs cycle. But sometimes we're going through glycolysis and we don't have oxygen yet. So what if we finished glycolysis and we have pyruvate, but we don't yet have oxygen? Well, I'm just pointing out that oxygen is not present. I'm just pointing out that that's not the end of the world. We're not going to die. I'm not going to ask you this on the exam. So all you have to know is that in order for us to move from glycolysis into the Krebs cycle, we need oxygen. That's all I'm asking you to know. But as a next level, for those who are interested, when we finish glycolysis and we're left with pyruvic acid, what if we don't have oxygen? If we don't have oxygen, we're going to take that pyruvate, convert it back into lactate and NADH+, and then that NADH+ is going to re-enter glycolysis that allows us to convert more pyruvate. So if we don't have oxygen, we have a way of buying some time. We basically just convert some things and produce and re-enter glycolysis and do the last couple of steps of glycolysis again and again. This isn't great. The downside of continuing to do glycolysis too long is that we have a buildup of lactate. While some lactate is good, a buildup of lactate is bad. And that's what we're talking about here. So I want to point out, sometimes lactic acid or lactate gets a bad name. By the way, lactate is what it's called when it circulates in the blood. So it's immediately produced as lactic acid, but it's quickly altered slightly to be lactate, which is what circulates in the blood. Lactate is not bad. God, people give such a bad rap. Lactate is a normal part of the process. Lactate, normal part of the process. Normal. And as a matter of fact, we can actually burn some lactate to make more pyruvate and make more ATP. So lactate can actually be its own energy source. There's a lot of research right now talking about some parts of the body, like the central nervous tissue, that is very good at using lactate to produce ATP in quick situations. So lactate is not bad on its own. However, lactate can become dangerous if it builds up excessively. So some lactate is fine. But if we spend too long in glycolysis, meaning we don't have oxygen to move into the Krebs cycle, if we spend too long in glycolysis, we're going to continue to produce lactate, and it can build up excessively. And when it builds up excessively, it can become acidic. Maybe you've heard of lactic acidosis. Can turn the blood acidic, can be very bad. There is a bit of a fallacy that one of the reasons why people who exercise hit a quote-unquote wall is that it's lactic acid buildup. And to be honest with you, the research hasn't shown that to be a direct cause and effect. We think lactate is somewhat involved because we know that a buildup of lactate is not good. But when we do controlled studies, athletes that have a buildup of lactic acid are not necessarily more likely to become fatigued. All right. Okay. What I want to do here is I'm going to end this first part of the lecture. I've been talking for a while. You probably need a break. I may need a break. So I'm going to pick up this second part of the lecture with the Krebs cycle, and then we'll finish it off.